and so forth. And basically the poor dog just lies down and dies. And then the little mice, I guess it
Mice, the little robots.
the little robot mice run out and basically disassemble the dog and clean it all up. And so we just go on through the routine. That's the whole story. Is just what a home routine of all the normal domestic things that we normally do. And
Without any of the people.
Without any of the people anywhere. There's absolutely no human interaction because there are no humans around. And then something goes wrong. There's a branch crashes through the window, hits something, ignites a fire, and the place catches on fire, and it doesn't have a means of immediately fixing that. And so now we see, and this is where Marie gets to play with fire colors. You can see the sprinklers there in the center of the page. But I want to call your attention to panel 2. And I'm going to read the caption to you, talking about the fire. It fed upon Picassos and Matisses in the halls like delicacies, baking off the oily flesh, tenderly crisping the canvases into black shavings. So what I'd like to do is just pause in the discussion of the story, and let's take the color out first of all, and take a look at the black and white line art that really provided for this story. And I want to close up on those top 2 panels there. You can see, and you may recognize some of these paintings depending on how well you're familiar with Picasso and Matisse. But I'd like to point out one, just a little bit of extra culture today. This is the Picasso painting. It's called Nude in a Black Armchair, and Pablo Picasso painted it in 1932. And so I think Wood took a little bit of delight here in burning this. So, you know, terrible things happen. The place goes up in flames and nothing can stop it. And we go through the little aftermath here. And in the end, the automated system just keeps on going. Today is August 5th, 2026. So
We're getting close to that.
we are getting close to that now, aren't we?
So this story, it's interesting because the only word balloons in the entire story come from recorded voices, the radios that kind of move the day along in the home. You know, it's time for this to happen, and it's time for that, and oh, there's a fire. Otherwise, it's only Bradbury's words and Wood's art. And Bradbury was so impressed with this story, and he himself, for the story, he drew inspiration from a 1918 poem by Sarah Teasdale called There Will Come Soft Rains. And it's about the aftermath of war and how humanity will not be missed. And that's what this story illustrates, kind of grimly. And
Which is perfect for EC.
yeah, perfect for EC. And as Mike said, Wallace Wood obviously had a lot of fun with it, but Bradbury was so impressed that there's a lot of correspondence between publisher Bill Gaines and Ray Bradbury. And it all still exists, by the way, so it's wonderful to read now. But this was the first time that Ray wrote in a letter to the artist. And at the same time as There Will Come Soft Rains, Jack Kamen had illustrated a story called 0 Hour, and they both, Ray said he was moved by them. And so he wrote in Dear Wally Wood and Jack Kamen and commended the jobs that they did on his stories. And it's fascinating because Ray was a lover of comic books. He liked any kind of creative press, and he was following these artists. So he actually got into suggesting which artists he thought would fit with certain stories of his, and the partnership just, yep.
All right. So this was, as I said, this was not the next official adaptation, but it was an official adaptation. And so here's a quote from Ray. Not about this story in particular, but it's something that Tommy was referencing. I have nothing but the kindest regard and love for you, and this was addressed to Bill Gaines, Al Feldstein, Mr. Orlando, and Mr. Davis for work beautifully and handsomely and cleverly thought out. Long may we all work together. And this was actually published in the letters column for Weird Science number 17 in 1953, late 1952, actually.
It's maybe worth pointing out that Bradbury had been collecting newspaper comics since he was like 12 years, like 9 years old or something like that. Like he would scrapbook Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon and all of his favorites, and he kept this collection his whole life, and it's still in our private collector's hands. I've seen it's like 20 scrapbooks full of this, and
Yeah.
it was very weird back then for a guy in his 30s to still have his childhood comics. So I always say he was a comics collector before there were even comic books, really.
He was
Yes,
making
that's
them.
true.
Yeah,
That's true.
yeah.
And that the scrapbook is basically his assembly of indoor comic.
Yeah, yeah.
Here's another one. You want to read this one?
Sure.
My thanks for really fine adaptations and beautiful artwork you are doing on my stories. This is an entirely new experience to me, and I cannot tell you how much I appreciate the painstaking detail and thought you are putting into your efforts.
And that's from Shock Suspense Stories number 9. Not number 9. You got to know. You want to take this one? Can you see it?
It seems to me that again and again you achieve the exactly right atmosphere and angle in carrying out the story. You people have a way of continually making me happy. I can't thank you enough.
I also had that at Shock Suspense Stories 9, but that might be in there. I'm not sure. But anyway, these are taken from the letter columns of the EC Comics.
And he would write very long letters in from which they would excerpt these little quotes that they'd sprinkle through. There's quite a few Ray Bradbury letters in the EC Comics.
Now I'm showing you this one. This was drawn by Joe Orlando and has nothing to do with Ray Bradbury. But it is a famous story. It's called Judgment Day. And we're not going to go through it like we do the other stories today because it's not Ray Bradbury. But the premise of the story is Earth arrives, a representative from Earth arrives on this planet that's trying to join the solar union or galactic union or whatever.
Some sort of galactic alliance.
Yeah, right. So they want to join this galactic alliance. And so Earth sends a representative to find out if they qualify. And you can see him there approaching the people who live on the planet, getting out of a spaceship in the very first panel. And it turns out that people aren't people the way we think of them, they're robots. And there are two classes of robots, the red robots and the blue, red and blue, right?
Red and, yeah.
I read it in black and white, so I'm not sure.
They're orange and blue.
They're orange and blue. And and they're manufactured in the same place, and the only difference between the two orange and blue people is the coat of paint they get when they come out of the factory. Otherwise, they're completely identical.
Everything inside's the same.
Interchangeable parts, all of that kind of stuff. But there's a class situation where, and I forget which is orange or blue.
The orange ones are better
Right.
off. In Blue Town, it's a poorer area, and there's blue-only facilities and things. So,
And so forth. And so, I'm not going to go through the whole story and all the various details. I just want to share with you the concluding panel of the story, which he decides you're not qualified, you're not civilized enough.
not ready.
And he takes off and leaves. And then once he's in his spacesuit, he takes off his helmet, and we see for the first time that he's a black man. Now, in 1953, this was a very powerful statement in a comic book. And in fact, when EC wanted to reprint the story just a couple of years later, they got into a lot of trouble with it, and they basically flipped off the code and did it anyway. But this was a very powerful story, and it caused a lot of concern, a lot of comment, including from Ray Bradbury. Judgment Day should be required reading for every man, woman, and child in the United States. You've done a splendid thing here and deserve the highest commendation. And that was published in the Weird Fantasy Letter column a couple months later. So that's why I included this one, even though it's not one of his stories.
When you might be about to say this, but this is he wrote in often about his own stories to commend the jobs they did. This is the only time that Bradbury wrote into EC about a story that wasn't his. He was very, very impressed with this story, and privately, I know that he felt that Al Feldstein was starting to really come into his own as a writer, and it was because he was adapting Ray's stories.
Now here's also one of my favorites, The Flying Machine. And this was drawn by Bernard Kriegstein with colors by Marie Severin. Do you want me to continue, or do you want to say something?
Well, the flying machine,
It's science fiction, but it's not set in the future.
right, it's set in the distant past, and it's got a very oriental feel to it that Kriegstein, you know, his art lent itself very well to that. So again, I'm just gonna say it, it's a perfect marriage of talents. It's Feldstein's adaptation of Bradbury's story with the perfect artist for the story.
Right. And Kriegstein is considered one of the premier comics designers, not just, you know, a guy who fills in the panels, but he's actually designing on a very high level, on a very sophisticated level.
To the point that there was a lot of headbutting sometimes for his vision versus his editor's.
That's another panel, but
Yeah.
yes, you're right. Anyway, this looks so lovely. I just love to take a look at this. Now, this particular version that you're seeing here was colored by Marie, but she recolored it for a collection of Kriegstein stories that we published a few years ago. So she's riffing off her original work, but we've got really good color here on this. I hope it's coming across on the screen. And the idea is there's someone, I guess he's a farmer or something like that, and he invents a pair of wings that work and enable him to fly, and he soars past the emperor's palace, and then the emperor summons him, and I'm going to read just the bottom tier here. Is it not beautiful, Excellency? Excellency? Yes, he says, too beautiful. It is the only one in the world, and I am the inventor. The only one in the world, replies the emperor, and we move on to the last panel on the page. I swear it, says the inventor. Who else knows of this? No one, not even my wife. And so already you can probably see where this is going. And sure enough, in tier 2, panel 3 there, the swords come out. And they're going after this guy. And they're not ready for this technology, and they don't want anyone else to have it. So he gets executed.
And then, isn't that,
Go back. Should be. Go back. There it is. What did you want to say?
well, maybe you're gonna say this already, but he's playing with like a toy flying machine.
Yeah, he's playing with a toy. If you look at the last panel on the screen, he's playing with a toy on the flying machine.
So it already does kind of exist.
Yeah. And they make specific reference in the final tier to the Great Wall of China, and we don't want anybody coming over the Great Wall of China because it's protecting us from the rest of the world. So if they found out that they could fly, or that we knew how to fly, that would
Defeat it.
eliminate the protection of the wall against China. And then, you know, we close out on a reference to birds. So you see a lot of birds here in the final page. And it's just a beautifully done story, just so well crafted. And it's a great story on its own by Bradbury, but in Kriegstein's hands, it's really, if you haven't seen it, I strongly encourage you to find it. And in fact,
He wrote a letter.
he wrote a letter. Go ahead, Art.
The flying machine is the finest single piece of art and drawing I've seen in the comics in years. Beautiful work. I was so touched and pleased. It's World Science Fantasy number 25, September 1954.
Here's another piece that he wrote in. He said they had published an adaptation of another story of his called The King of the Gray Spaces. And he wrote in, he said, Severin and Elder in King of the Gray Spaces have a very fresh technique. I certainly hope you'll have them work on some other of my stories. I should think they would do well on something like The Millionaire Picnic. So The Millionaire Picnic was adapted. And it was drawn, in fact, by Severin and Elder. And colored by John Severin's sister, or younger sister, Marie. And this is also a really nice one. And it's not the kind of job I would have thought of necessarily to give to Severin and Elder. But I guess it's kind of a quiet story.
It is.
Would you call it a quiet story?
Very
Very
reflective.
reflective.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Literally,
not,
yeah.
not very much in, it's like one of the stories that made Ray Bradbury a great writer. It wasn't like, you know, monsters attacking people, anything like that. Yeah, it's a very subtle story.
And what it is a family. on Mars, and they're gonna go out on a picnic, and they're looking for Martians. And so here's where we get a look at Mars. This is what Mars looks like according to John Severin, with the canals and all of that, and Dad with a pipe. And so they're talking to the kids, and they're all discussing, and this gets very philosophical. I'm going to assume you don't want me to read every word bullet, but take it from me. It's a very nice conversation.
Yeah, and that's something to point out is like all the Bradbury's writing is all in those blocks there.
Yeah.
Feldstein was very wordy anyway, and Bradbury really wanted a lot of his original writing in the adaptation. So you'll see how much writing. Sometimes it takes up half the panel. And that's
if
all
you look
Bradbury's
at
writing.
the panels with the kids' faces, Bradbury was really impressed with the Severin and Elder artistic team's ability to draw children. And that's why this story came to mind for him as one that would be perfect for them.
So now here comes the spoiler. When they finally find the Martians, they discover, he says, look, right there in the lake, or the canal. And all they see is their own reflections. And I said, well, we live on Mars, we're the Martians.
Which is kind of the concept of the book and the movie The Martian. You know, it's an earthling living on Mars. So you always see Bradbury's themes just keep repeating themselves throughout pop culture.
All right, so I want to wrap up with this little bit of video. What during this period of time, Bradbury was writing these letters, and they had correspondence back and forth. But one thing he didn't do, and even though Al Feldstein really worked very hard to quote Bradbury exactly in the captions and the balloons, was to and Al Feldstein scripted most of these. I think Johnny Craig did one, and it had a huge influence on Feldstein. But what happened? Bradbury famously didn't like to fly, and he lived in California, and the EC offices were in New York. And he didn't like, and I don't think he didn't have a driver's license.
Bradbury never learned how to drive.
So there you go.
Ray Harryhausen used to drive him around LA all the time when they were young.
So Bradbury never made it to New York to meet with anybody at EC during the time period when they were adapting his stories. And he wasn't doing the adapting himself. That was Al Feldstein's job. And so it turns out that they never met in that very fertile period of all these terrific stories, 27 or 30, depending on how you count. And they didn't meet until Saturday, August 3rd, 2002, at the San Diego Comic-Con. Now, if you were in the room that day, you may remember this. But if you weren't in the room that day, you have never seen this, and neither has anybody else in the world.
Never met Al Feldstein, never. I think it's about time that happened. Ladies and gentlemen, the James Gunn DC Comics, Mr. Al Feldstein. Stories 4 times a week. I mean, we're really desperate.
And he brought in some story ideas. And I said, hey, you know, those two, if you combine them, would be pretty good. He didn't tell me they were Ray Bradbury. And that's the two stories combined that I wrote as an original story that Ray caught me with. And it was the start of, I want to tell you, Ray, if I can keep myself the most inspiring years of my life.
So that was the moment, and I want to thank Mark Svensson, who provided that little bit of video. Any questions?
Yes, yeah, you were saying Ray Bradbury would write in suggestions to which artists did the stories. How much was that followed? If,
Well, we know one instance where it was
well,
followed
I saw,
directly.
yes, I did.
It probably had more to do with who was available to do what than what Ray wanted, and if it could coincide, that'd be great, but if it didn't, they still had to get a book out. So, within a certain context, I think they would try to please Ray because they wanted to keep him on the good side. And, but other than that, I don't know. I wasn't there.
Well, I didn't know if it had the letters or.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't seen all the correspondence, so.
That was the one instance where he specifically asked for certain artists on a certain story. They published that letter, and the answer was, funny you should ask.
Yeah.
Hi, speaking of Ray not driving, I have my own little short anecdote about meeting, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
I was at the Smokehouse in the 1980s, a popular restaurant, and I saw Ray Bradbury, and he asked the host to call him a cab, because as you said, he didn't drive. And he said, I'm Ray Bradbury, and it meant nothing to the kid. He just, okay, I'll call a cab for you. So I got my garlic bread, and I came out and I saw Ray Bradbury standing all by himself. He seemed a little off-put. And I said, wow, it was like a million-year picnic in there, huh? Like, hey.
That's great.
Yeah, that panel that Bradbury and Feldstein met for the first time, was that Mark Evanier moderating?
Yes, that was Mark Evanier, and Julie Schwartz was also on that panel. It was supposed to be his panel, him and Ray Bradbury, because Julie was Bradbury's first agent. And so they were doing a reunion at San Diego Comic-Con. Mark wrote about this in his blog, by the way. If you go to his blog, anybody know Mark's blog, News from Me?
Yeah.
Newsfromme.com. And you can just type in Feldstein Bradbury and you'll get it. You'll see it's a cute little story.
We're getting the cane here.
Yeah.